Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing headaches. Okay, so we're currently in the process of discussing the anatomy of the meninges, and what we've so far seen is that the pia mater is the innermost layer of the meninges, and that it's very closely adhered to the surface of the central nervous system. We've then begun our discussion of the dura mater, and we've discussed that the dura mater is the complete opposite. It's the outermost meninge, and it's adhered to the bone that protects the central nervous system, so the skull and the vertebral column, the inside of the vertebral column. We've also seen the fact that the dura mater has two separate layers, the periosteal layer, the outer layer, and the meningeal layer. And we're in the process of discussing these complicated things about the anatomy of the dura mater, namely the dural folds and the dural venous sinuses. So we've been discussing the anatomy of the dural folds. Dural folds are where the meningeal dura mater, and I don't quite know what's happened there, the meningeal dura mater evaginates outwards into the cranial cavity, and there are two major examples of dural folds. The falx cerebri, which is where the midline sagittal meningeal dura mater of the skull evaginates downwards to form a dural fold that lies all the way along between the two cerebral hemispheres in the longitudinal fissure. So just getting my other picture back up. So remember, it's in this gap in between the two cerebral hemispheres. And just to make sure you understand this, the pia mater will be lining all of this cerebral cortex. So the pia mater is still closer to that portion of cerebral cortex than this meningeal dura mater that is folded inwards. The pia mater, remember, you can think of it as having the exact same shape as the surface of the brain. So it's always going to be the meninge that is closest to the brain. Okay, so that's the falx cerebri, this evagination of meningeal dura mater inwards into the longitudinal fissure between the two cerebral hemispheres. Then we saw the other one, the tentorium cerebelli, and the two are joined together. The falx cerebri comes right to the back, where, of course, there is the junction between the cerebral hemispheres and the cerebellum below, and then it's going to be continuous with the tentorium cerebelli, which again is a dural fold and has this shape shown here. It's attached anteriorly to the top of the petrous portions of the temporal bone, and then it stretches backwards. And again, this is made by evaginating meningeal dura mater away from the surface of the skull here to create this connective tissue layer. And it's continuous with the falx cerebri at the bottom, and this line here shows where the falx cerebri and the tentorium cerebelli would be continuous with one another. And underneath the tentorium cerebelli is going to be the cerebellum, above the tentori cerebelli is going to be the cerebral hemispheres, and there is this nice gap where the brain stem can pass through. Okay, so those are the dural folds. Now to turn on to the dural venous sinuses, which are even more complicated. So, the dural venous sinuses are venous sinuses. They are spaces where venous blood is going to drain into that are in between layers of the dura mater. So you can create spaces in between the layers of the dura mater. You can imagine pulling the meningeal dura mater away from the periosteal dura mater to create a little space here. In fact, you don't even need to imagine it. I will draw it for you now. So, again, here in orange, this is representing the bone, of course. And then inside of the bone, we'll then have the periosteal dura mater, here in blue again. And then inside of the periosteal dura mater, you will then have the meningeal dura mater, but I'm now going to imagine that I've pulled it away from the periosteal dura mater to create a little space there in between the meningeal and the periosteal dura mater, the two layers of the dura mater. And this, we could fill it with venous blood, so I'll colour that in blue there, and that can now be a dural venous sinus. So this is how we create dural venous sinuses, by creating spaces in between the two layers of the dura mater, the periosteal dura mater and the meningeal dura mater. And there are some major dural venous sinuses that we need to know the names of, which are the superior sagittal sinus, the inferior sagittal sinus, the straight sinus, the transverse sinus, the sigmoid sinus, the cavernous sinus, the superior petrosal sinus, and the inferior petrosal sinus. So 8 dural venous sinuses that I now want to show you the position of. So let's start off with the superior sagittal sinus. Now the superior sagittal sinus is actually right at the top of the falx cerebri. So where the falx cerebri is attached up to the surface of the skull here, in that space there's going to be a dural venous sinus that is going to be the superior sagittal sinus. So let me just talk you through this a little bit more. How can a dural fold have a venous sinus as well? So here is a picture of a dural fold. We can imagine that this is the falx cerebri, this is a portion of the skull, here's the periosteal dura mater. What you can imagine doing is easing this adhesion between the two layers of meningeal dura mater apart. Imagine pulling that apart and creating a little space in there. That's how we can create a space at the point where the falx cerebri is attached to the periosteal dura mater, which is then attached to the bone at the top. And that's how we're going to create the superior sagittal sinus. So let me mark this on, and I'll get a thicker blue pen for marking this on. So in this position, all the way around like that, where the falx cerebri is attached to the periosteal dura mater at the top, this is going to be where the superior sagittal sinus is. There's going to be a space there, and that's going to contain venous blood, and that's the superior sagittal sinus. So let me label this on. So there's not much room for labels. It was a bad choice of position to put this picture. So that is the superior because it's at the top, and then sagittal because it's in the sagittal plane, it's in the mid-sagittal plane, right in between the two cerebral hemispheres. So superior sagittal, and then it's a sinus. It contains a lot of venous blood. And which way is the venous blood going to be draining? I'll tell you where the venous blood is coming from. It's coming from the brain parenchyma. I'll tell you how it gets there later on. So the dural venous sinuses, they drain blood from the brain parenchyma. Which way is the blood going to be draining? It's going to be draining backwards, back to here. This gap where, of course, the falx cerebri is meeting the tentorium cerebelli below. Now, here, right at the back of the junction between the falx cerebri and the tentorium cerebelli, we're going to open up a space there. And again, this is stretching your visualization capacities. But imagine we're going to pull away the meningeal dura mater from the periosteal dura mater to create a space there at this base where both the falx cerebri and the tentorium cerebelli are attached. And there's going to be a nice little space which is going to be part of the dural venous sinus network. And that's going to be known as the confluence of the sinuses. So I'm going to draw this in even bigger there. So I now need to remember to go back to the thinner pen. So that place there is, and I've already gone wrong, get rid of that. It's called the confluence of the sinuses, and lots of other dural venous sinuses are going to come into this confluence. So confluence means where loads of things are coming together. So it's the confluence of the sinuses, where lots of the dural venous sinuses are all going to come together. Okay, so we've done the superior sagittal sinus. It's going to be draining into this confluence of the sinuses. We'll talk about where the confluence of the sinuses is going to be located later on, but I hope you understand how this can work. Again, it's always gaps in between either two layers of meningeal dura mater or in between meningeal dura mater and periosteal dura mater. It's gaps within the dura mater that is where these dural venous sinuses are going to be. Okay, next dural venous sinus is the inferior sagittal sinus. Where do you think this is going to be? It's going to be at the bottom of the falx cerebri. So it's actually going to be just above the corpus callosum. So in this position here, and it's going to come all the way back again to the bottom of the falx cerebri here. So let me label this one up. And also let me just explain how this one can actually form. So of course, we discussed how the superior sagittal sinus could form. We imagined pulling a space here, but right at the bottom of the dural fold here, we could also open up a space in between the two layers of meningeal dura mater here, and we could turn that into a dural venous sinus, and that's exactly how we're going to create the inferior sagittal sinus. So that's what this is. Over here, this has been created. We've created a space in between the two layers of meningeal dura mater right at the base of the falx cerebri to create another dural venous sinus, and that is the inferior sagittal sinus. So let me put its name on here. In fact, I won't put its name on here because we've already put superior sagittal sinus. I'll just put inferior. Actually, no, I will write out its name in full. So that's the inferior sagittal sinus, another dural venous sinus. So both of these are draining backwards. They're draining the brain parenchyma. Lots of venous blood from the brain, from the two cerebral hemispheres, is coming into these sagittal sinuses, the superior and the inferior sagittal sinus, and they're both going to drain backwards. We know that the superior sagittal sinus is draining into the confluence of the sinuses. The inferior sagittal sinus is also going to drain into the confluence of the sinuses. The question is, how is it going to drain into the confluence of the sinuses? It's in the wrong place. But of course, we know, right at the bottom of the falx cerebri, we know this is continuous with the tentorium cerebelli. We've got loads of meningeal dura mater here, where we've got it folding back on itself. So we can just open up spaces here. Again, we're stretching your visualization capacity. But remember, the tentorium cerebelli down here, it's two layers of meningeal dura mater. All the time, it's two layers of meningeal dura mater. So right at the base, where the falx cerebri is meeting the tentorium cerebelli, we can open up a space there in between meningeal dura mater. And indeed we do, and that's another dural venous sinus known as the straight sinus. So, blue pen, thick blue pen out again. That sinus connecting the inferior sagittal sinus to the confluence of the sinuses, that is known as the straight sinus. So again, I'll write its name down here, because it's very straight compared to the sagittal sinuses. So this is the straight sinus, draining the inferior sagittal sinus into the confluence of the sinuses. Right, so all of this venous blood is nicely now coming into the confluence of the sinuses. The question is, where's it going to go from there? Well, the confluence of the sinuses drain into things called the transverse sinuses, and these are going to run at the base of the tentorium cerebelli. So, here is a good picture of the tentorium cerebelli. Here, remember, at the back of the skull here, the occipital region of the skull, here's where the tentorium cerebelli has actually come off from. It's evaginated off here. This is where the meningeal dura mater of the tentorium cerebelli is attached to the periosteal dura mater. We've got the confluence of the sinuses here, so I might just try and put that on in, again, my thick blue pen. So here's the confluence of the sinuses. The question now is, the transverse sinuses, where are they? They're going to be at these bases of the tentorium cerebelli, in these positions. So again, it's just like when we were imagining the superior sagittal sinuses, and that was made by creating a space at the place where the falx cerebri was attached to the periosteal dura mater. It's exactly the same thing that's going to happen here. So get me a pen and I'll put this in here. So in this position here, these are where the transverse sinuses are going to go. And imagine that that one doesn't go quite as far as I've drawn it. It needs to come to this sort of level. This is a good side. This side's the side to look at. This side I've gone a bit too far forward. Okay, so those sinuses there, and I've forgotten to go back to the thinner pen. Those are the transverse sinuses. So we've seen a lot of dural venous sinuses. We've seen the sagittal sinus, we've seen the inferior sagittal sinus, we've seen the straight sinus, we've seen the confluence of the sinuses, and we've now seen the transverse sinuses on either side. So you've got two transverse sinuses, a left transverse sinus and a right transverse sinus. Now, where are these going to drain into? So the blood is coming from the confluence of the sinuses out into the two transverse sinuses. Where are these going to drain into? Well, overall, they're going to drain into the inferior jugular vein, which forms at the opening of the jugular foramen, which is at the bottom. Well, no, I need my laser pointer. If we draw another picture, which I will do in just a moment, of what the cranial cavity looks like if we look at it from above, and we don't have the tentorium cerebelli in here, just in this bottom portion of the wall here, the bottom portion of the petrous portion of the temporal bone, you can see the jugular foramen, which is where the internal jugular vein begins. So, indeed, what we need to do now is draw another one of these pictures here. And this time, I don't want to put the tentorium cerebelli in because I want to see the bottom of the posterior cranial fossa. Here, I can only see the bit of the posterior cranial fossa above the tentorium cerebelli. I need to see the bit below the tentorium cerebelli because that's where the jugular foramen is. Okay, so another one of these pictures. I'm just going to move this upwards a little bit. Okay, so in orange again, drawing the exact same picture. This is, we've cut off the top of the skull and we're looking down into the cranial cavity. So again, here is the anterior cranial fossa, the clinoid processes. We'll have the sella turcica here. We'll have the chiasmatic groove there. And then here are the petrous portions of the temporal bone, demarcating the end of the middle cranial fossae and the beginning of the posterior cranial fossa. Here is the foramen magnum, and now let me put in the jugular foramens. So there is one, there's the left one, and here is the right one. So they are in the floor of the posterior cranial fossa, and they're very, very big holes. If you see a skull model, you can easily pick out these two holes. Above them will be the internal acoustic meatus, which is the hole through which the vestibular cochlear nerve and the facial nerve go through. So don't confuse that with the jugular foramen. The jugular foramina are lower down, and these are where the internal jugular veins will begin. Right, so we have the transverse sinuses up here that are coming these ways. Where are they now going to drain into? They're going to drain into something called the sigmoid sinuses. Now, the sigmoid sinuses are this picture here. They actually look like this picture that I've drawn you here, whereas all the other sinuses that I've shown you so far, the superior and inferior sagittal sinuses, the straight sinuses, the confluence of the sinuses, the transverse sinuses, they're all more complicated than this picture because they're in the dural folds. Whereas now, finally, the sigmoid sinus is not going to be in a dural fold. This is actually going to be one of these sinuses where it is just in between the meningeal dura mater and the periosteal dura mater, and the meningeal dura mater is not forming a meningeal dura mater fold. So we're now going below the tentorium cerebelli, and below the tentorium cerebelli, of course, the dural fold will have ended. So now we can use this picture again here. We can imagine this is the tentorium cerebelli. We can imagine this is the top, this is the bottom of the tentorium cerebelli. The transverse sinus is in this position. We're now going to create another sinus that's going to drain this, that's going to come off like so. It's going to, if the end of the transverse sinus is here, it's now going to begin in that gap between the meningeal dura mater and the periosteal dura mater, and this is called the sigmoid dural venous sinus. So let me put this on. And the reason it's called that is it looks like an S, although in my opinion it looks more like an integral sign compared to an S. So it's in this sort of position like so. Okay, and whoops, I've managed to make a complete mess over here. And will that one go? No, it won't. Let me get the thinner pen back. And I'm just waging war on these annoying little dots that I've managed to put on. Right, back to work then. So, those sinuses that I've put on there, and they don't particularly look like integral signs the way I've drawn them, but they do go in this sort of pattern. They go down and then they move into that, so it's kind of like an S. And if you look at this one on its side, it does kind of look like an integral shape. This is the top of the integral, this is the bottom of the integral, that's the vertical portion of the integral sign. So these sinuses that I've put on here, and I'll just label them up, those are called the sigmoid sinuses. So they're going to drain the transverse sinuses, and I hope I've explained how they can link up to the transverse sinuses. Again, think of this picture. Let this picture represent the tentorium cerebelli here. The transverse sinus is in this position of the tentorium cerebelli. If we get to the end of the transverse sinus, this bit, then it will end, and where's it going to drain into? It drains into a space that's in between the meningeal dura mater and the periosteal dura mater, and it's in this position. So all of this bone down here is lined by both periosteal and meningeal dura mater, and in the space between the periosteal and the meningeal dura mater, in this position, are the sigmoid sinuses. And then the blood is going to drain from the sigmoid sinus into the internal jugular veins, which are going to leave through the internal jugular foramens here, or the jugular foramens rather. So, from those sigmoid sinuses out the jugular foramens are going to be the internal jugular veins. So this is how we're draining blood from the brain. So it's going to go into the internal jugular veins. And the way that will work is you'll have a temporary hole in the periosteal dura mater. So remember, this is in between the periosteal and the meningeal dura mater. Where the jugular foramen is, you'll have a hole in the periosteal dura mater, and then this sinus will come down to that hole, and then the blood will be able to pass through that hole in the periosteal dura mater, because there'll be a hole here, so it'll pass through there, through the hole in the bone. So imagine that we've chiseled a hole through the periosteal dura mater, we've chiseled a hole through the bone, which is the jugular foramen. It will then pass through that hole, and then on this side there will be a vein waiting to catch all of that blood, and that vein is the internal jugular vein. There'll be two, one on each side, the left and right internal jugular veins, and they'll take the blood down and away. Okay, so we've done a lot of dural venous sinuses now. We've done the superior sagittal sinus, we've done the inferior sagittal sinus, the straight sinus, the transverse sinuses, the sigmoid sinuses. I have 3 more to do. The cavernous sinuses, the superior petrosal sinuses, and the inferior petrosal sinuses. So, where are the cavernous sinuses? The cavernous sinuses are either side of the sella turcica. So again, all of this bone here, it's lined by both periosteal and meningeal dura mater, and we can open up big gaps in between the periosteal and the meningeal dura mater, and we're going to do that in this position here to create 2 big sinuses on either side of the sella turcica, and they form actually the lateral boundaries of the pituitary fossa. Okay, and those 2 sinuses that we formed there are called the cavernous sinuses. So I'll remind you that they are spaces in between the periosteal and meningeal dura mater. We've opened up a space in between the periosteal and the meningeal dura mater. So over the top of these, there is meningeal dura mater. If we chisel down, we'd enter the actual sinus itself, and if we chisel further through the sinus, we'd then get to the bottom of the sinus, which is then lined by the periosteal dura mater. So the top of the sinus is the meningeal dura mater, and then the bottom is the periosteal dura mater. Now, there are 2 sinuses that are going to connect the cavernous sinuses up to the sigmoid sinuses, so that the cavernous sinuses can drain into the internal jugular vein as well. And these are the superior and inferior petrosal sinuses. So the superior petrosal sinus is in this position. It runs along the top of the petrous portion of the temporal bone and then drains into the top of the sigmoid sinus, like so. So that's the position of the superior, because it's on the top, and petrosal because it's running along the petrous portion of the temporal bone, and then it's a venous sinus. And again, remember that all of this bone is covered by both the periosteal and the meningeal dura mater, and to create that sinus, all you have done is pulled a little gap in between the periosteal and the meningeal dura mater, so that you've created that little tube through which blood can flow, and then it's continuous with this tube that's formed in the same way behind, which is the top of the sigmoid sinus. Okay, and then there is the inferior petrosal sinus, which goes more steeply downward like so, and then drains into the bottom of the sigmoid sinus just before it then empties into the internal jugular vein through the jugular foramen. Those ones are the inferior petrosal sinuses. So inferior petrosal sinus is. Okay, so those are all the dural venous sinuses that I want to talk about. We have learned about all the 8 that I originally listed. The superior sagittal sinus, the inferior sagittal sinus, the straight sinus, the transverse sinuses, the sigmoid sinuses, the cavernous sinuses, the superior petrosal sinuses, and the inferior petrosal sinuses. And I hope you do understand the anatomy of how you can actually create these things by opening up gaps either in between periosteal and meningeal dura mater, or in between 2 pieces of meningeal dura mater if we're talking about the ones that are inside the dural folds. Okay, right. Now let me just say a little bit more about how these things actually fill up with blood. So they drain the brain parenchyma, the cerebral hemispheres. They have lots of veins. They need to drain somewhere, and they drain into the dural venous sinuses. Now, that means that veins coming from the brain parenchyma is going to have to penetrate through layers of the meninges. It's going to have to penetrate through the pia mater. It's then going to have to penetrate through something called the subarachnoid space, which we'll come on to. It's going to have to penetrate through the arachnoid mater, and it's then going to have to penetrate through the meningeal dura mater to get into the dural venous sinus. So these veins that cross all of those layers of the meninges, they have a special name, and they are called bridging veins. So this is a name that people expect you to know, so I'm giving it to you now. So bridging veins are the veins from the brain parenchyma that are draining venous blood from the brain parenchyma, which bridge across all of those meningeal layers to get into the dural venous sinuses. And this is how blood is going to drain into the dural venous sinuses, and then it all flows eventually out into the internal jugular veins through the pathways that I've shown you. Okay, right. So that is the dural venous sinuses completed. Our discussion of that is completed. And those are the two really complicated bits about the dura mater completed. We've done dural folds and we've done dural venous sinuses. Fantastic. We can now talk about the last layer, which is the arachnoid mater, and then we can talk about the gap between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, called the subarachnoid space. So, the arachnoid mater. We have now just done the dura mater. We've discussed the fact that the dura mater is complicated. It's got these two layers, the periosteal dura mater and the meningeal dura mater. The meningeal dura mater evaginates out to create these dural folds, and there are gaps in between the meningeal and the periosteal dura mater, which are these dural venous sinuses. I want you now, once you've constructed that structure, once you understand that structure, once you've constructed that structure in your mind, you've managed to visualize it in your mind, I want you now to line all of the meningeal dura mater with another layer. I want you to line it with the arachnoid mater. So everywhere where there is meningeal dura mater exposed in the cranial cavity or the vertebral canal, I want you to cover it with another layer, which is the arachnoid mater. So the arachnoid mater is going to be attached to the dura mater layers rather than the pia mater layers. So let me now just put this in. So in green, inside of the meningeal dura mater, you're now going to have the arachnoid mater. And this is going to follow all of the silly shapes of the meningeal dura mater, all of these silly dural folds that the meningeal dura mater creates. The arachnoid mater is going to follow them all. So all of the meningeal dura mater, it's all got to be covered up by the arachnoid mater. So you need to do that. You can recolor it in now. Instead of having it red, you now need to have it coated with green. So we're not going to see the meningeal dura mater anymore. It's coated now with the arachnoid mater. Okay, and here's the final bit of the story of the meninges. Now you've got your cranial cavity here and your vertebral column. You've got your dura mater, both layers, and you've got that now lined by the arachnoid mater. Now I want you to put the brain back in, which is coated with the pia mater. So the pia mater is exactly coating the lining of the brain, the surface of the brain and the spinal cord. Now there is going to be a space in between the pia mater, which covers the brain, and the arachnoid mater, which lines the meningeal dura mater. That space is called the subarachnoid space. So let me put this here. So that space is called the subarachnoid space. All of that space that's produced, that's the subarachnoid space. And that space is going to be filled with cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. And I don't think I've actually written out in full what CSF stands for, so I think at some point in this video I'm going to have to, so we'll do it now. So CSF stands for cerebrospinal fluid. It's the fluid that is contained within the ventricles, the lateral ventricles, the third ventricle, the fourth ventricle. It's contained in the central canal of the medulla and the spinal cord, and it's also contained in this huge great space in between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater, that is the subarachnoid space, and this cushions the whole central nervous system. It means that the whole central nervous system is suspended in a nice fluid bath, the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, of course, The central nervous system itself is not touching the cerebrospinal fluid because it's lined by the pia mater, and it's the outer surface of the pia mater that is in contact with the cerebrospinal fluid that is in the subarachnoid space. So, I hope that that has kind of painted a picture of the anatomy of the meninges to you. Remember, the brain is coated by the pia mater, and the other layers of the meninges, they are attached to the bone, and therefore the innermost layer of those bone-attached meninges is the arachnoid mater, and all of the space in between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, that we're going to fill with a beautiful fluid called cerebrospinal fluid, which has lots of electrolytes in and is a very nice fluid for the brain to be bathed in. This nicely cushions the brain. It means that if we are chucking our head around a little bit, if we're chucking our body around and our head's going all over the place, then hopefully the brain's not going to bang up against the skull because it's got this nice fluid cushioning it between itself and the skull, so it's got that cushioning it. Okay, so that is the way that the anatomy of the meninges work. One last thing that I want to say is, because we've got this space in between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater, at certain places you can end up with a big gap between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater, and then you can end up with a big lump of cerebrospinal fluid being there. And there is one particular place where this occurs, and it's right at the base of the cerebellum here. Okay, so here, of course, the pia mater will be beautifully lining the brain, so it will be going into this crevice, but the arachnoid mater doesn't do that. The arachnoid mater will be lining the meningeal dura mater, which will be lining the periosteal dura mater, which will be attached to the bone. So if I just put this on here, let's put the pia mater on first. The pia mater is going to be beautifully attached to the brain, so there's the pia mater in our aquamarine colour here, whereas the arachnoid mater, it's going to be more like this, and of course it will go down as well like this. And outside of the arachnoid mater, you'll then have the meningeal dura mater and the periosteal dura mater, but that leaves a quite big gap there where you've got a hefty amount of cerebrospinal fluid, and this is right in the middle, if we're taking a sagittal cross-section through here, that you'd find this space, and that's known as the cisterna magna, that little space there. So that space where you've got a big amount of cerebrospinal fluid is called the cisterna magna, and that's the main place where you've got a big gap in between the pia mater, which is adhered to the brain, and the arachnoid mater, which is adhered to the dura mater. Okay, so keep trying to visualize this whilst we have a break. It's very, very important to understand this. It's difficult to visualize, but once you have successfully got your head around it and you can successfully visualize it, you will understand it forevermore. It won't ever be difficult for you to understand it ever again. You'll instantly be able to visualize it and you'll know what you're talking about. Okay, so in the next video, we'll turn our attention on to discussing the anatomy of the innervation of the meninges.